All right, thank you. So, well, thank you all for inviting me here and coming in early June, at the moment that I'm sure you're all looking forward to getting back into your research projects. It's an honor to be here. I realized as I was driving around, especially when I was on Moctezuma Boulevard, I think it is, that it's a joke I often tell to my students is that the thing that got me interested in Latin America was actually my mother, who's an academic, who's now emeritus at DePaul University. And when I was in high school, she was doing her field research in Mexico, studying the Aztec sacrifice. So my childhood was, I was raised by a mother studying and writing a book about Aztec sacrifice. So if there's anything wrong with me, but I realize that I can't use that joke here. I mean, it'd be if there's anything right about me, this is because I was an Aztec from a young age. So I won't go over too many of these things because they were already mentioned. But I'll mention briefly a little bit of background regarding to the grants and fellowships. You'll see that over since 2003, I've applied to usually on an annual basis. So I won't list all the ones I didn't get, right? That would take a couple slides, but you know, a few came through, and most recently the ACLS Burkhardt Fellowship this year. Now, those that are in bold are supported a year of research. So I'd love to take some of this into this program. I know that looking for resources and grants and fellowships are going to be crucial for this. So I'd like to take those skills in for that. First book, Hierarchies of Slavery. Again, I argued that the brutality that was inherent in slavery wasn't equally shared, and how and why that was the case. Other projects I have currently underway. My main project is the one I'm going to be presenting on, this Era of Epidemics for Brazil. But I'm also very much interested in a very kind of semantic, discursive project looking at the history of race in Brazil. This was a time in which, just like today, there are many categories of race, and trying to make sense of this and how these changed in the geography of the taxonomies of race for Brazil is of interest. I'm also, I see you guys have a great digital humanities lab. As a kind of hobby, I do a little bit of programming, so I'm working with Python to try to automate and build some meta search engines. There's these runaway databases that can be united through a kind of meta search process, and I was at UCI presenting on that recently. But that's also another interest. Hopefully not too much to distract me from the main project, which is Brazil's Era of Epidemics, and I'll talk about that today. So let me set the stage. We're looking at the Empire of Brazil in the province of Bahia. We'll zoom in. This is a map from 1850s, and this is around the period that I'm going to be talking about. The Bahia de Todos os Santos, and the beautiful city on that large bay, which is, of course, the city of Bahia or Salvador. And more specifically, we're going to go right into the port city, right at the harbor, and I'm going to introduce you to the acting U.S. consul, a man named Thomas Turner, who had taken the job earlier the year in 1849 after scandal ended his predecessor's career abruptly. He was a young guy, 29 years old, and he was on an errand. This isn't a picture of him specifically, but it's probably very similar to how he traveled down to the waterfront. He was on an errand, a very anxious-ridden errand, I would imagine, because his trip was to carry him down to the port to go to a ship that was rumored to be killing nearby sailors on nearby anchoring ships, and was a kind of this vessel carrying this poisonous gas from miasma, right? But he wasn't going down to look for that specifically. He was actually on his way down to look at the ship because it was a U.S. flag, and it was reported to have been engaged in the illegal slave trade. So he was to go there and look for the accoutrements of slave trade, such as shacks and chains and irons and other items that might mark the slave trader. If he had looked behind the heavy curtain, he would have seen really no escape to his trip down to the waterfront, because Salvador is still to this day, although the transportation has improved, wedged between the cliff and the harbor. And really at this point in the mid-19th century, the only way up and down was on the shoulders, the backs of slaves, who would, the porters who would carry passengers and goods up. No carts, cabs, or carriages could ascend this cliff. So he was probably carried down in this way, and he would have been set down near one of the warehouses, where he would have boarded a pilot ship to go out to one of the waiting ships, to go out to this so-called ghost ship and visit. You might imagine him pushing his handkerchief to his mouth to guard against the deadly miasma as he came to the ship and descended into its dark hold. Well, we don't know if he found any evidence of slavery, or maybe he did. It's not reported. But what is very likely is that as he was in the dank hold of this so-called ghost ship, a female mosquito bit him, seeking blood to mature the mosquito's eggs, her eggs, right? Unfortunately for the acting consul Thomas Turner, and for thousands of Bahamians going about their everyday lives in this busy port city, the second busiest in South America at the time, this mosquito harbored a virus. We could, I assume, I suppose. I think it's a good chance. And in that virus went through a proboscis 1/4 the size of a human hair into the consul's capillaries. And as Thomas Turner went back up to the more genteel neighborhood of the upper town, he probably felt great relief. But unsuspecting to him, I assume again that there was this virus beginning to circulate in his system, because only about 3 weeks later he died of yellow fever. Historians recognize that these diseases came, and they often attribute importance to them. But no one has ever put together a story that makes a suggestion that, or called this era of epidemics for Brazil, made the case that we need to include the history of disease and environment when we're talking about things like the political transformation of the empire to the republic, the end of slavery, the explosive growth in Brazil's population in the early 20th century, and the switch to coffee instead of sugar. All of these major events and processes that made Brazil what Brazil is today in the 21st century, a more urbanized society with a lot of wealth and power in the southeast, I think owes in an important part, to the history of disease. And that's the case I'm making today. So historians generally have there's a large amount of argumentation, friendly argumentation about the details and the details of this story. But generally, historians have a kind of consensus that places great importance on the history of disease for the colonial period. Now, how much emphasis you put on it, how much emphasis you put on cruelty, warfare, that's debated, the numbers of deaths. But folks like Jared Diamond, Alfred Crosby, Charles Mann, these are all well-known historians, who've written popular history books, that wide readership, that make the case. And the general story goes like this, right? You have Eurasia connected to Africa, two large continents that are relatively well connected by trade and migration. Right? Contrast that with the Americas, in which you have two very large continents, but much less connected by trade and migration. Okay, that's number one. Number two is the number of domesticated animals. Eurasians, Africans lived next to, slept next to their pigs, their poultry, and with them shared all kinds of diseases. Right? Now, there were very few domesticated animals in the Americas. You had the llama, for example, but very few domesticated animals to trade diseases with. So when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, we had one group of people who, because of the environment, the accidental environmental and geographical conditions that they came from, arrived in the Americas carrying with them a number of communicable diseases in which they had either, and this is where there's also a lot of debates, innate or acquired resistance to these diseases. I think in most cases acquired. They had encountered, survived encounter with some of these diseases, such as smallpox, survived, but then brought it with them. Right? And so the result, of course, was a catastrophe, as much as 90% decline in population in the Americas, one of the most tragic chapters, right, in world history. Again, I think we can't exclude the cruelty and warfare, the kind of broken spears story, but disease is clearly central. So the reason I raise this is because there is just general consensus that for the 17th century, for the 16th and 17th century, diseases really matter, right? Really matter. For the 18th and 19th, however, there's this kind of idea that diseases, that there's some sort of stabilization, and that the diseases don't change as greatly as they did during the colonial period. Now, I agree with that, but I think what we find is that there is still great deals of shifting of the epidemiological environment in Latin America, and this is the case for Brazil as well. So the colonial era of epidemics, you might call it, was certainly tragic for Brazil. Large decrease in population, probably from smallpox. These are likely candidates: smallpox, measles, fevers, influenza, for example, maybe plague, but a variety of diseases killed 75%, 90% of indigenous peoples in colonial Brazil, like they did in many parts of Latin America. By the end of the 17th century, we have much smaller population of indigenous peoples that begin to stabilize and then begin to regain its growth. Right? Very slowly from this. So that this period ends, I would say, right around that point. And then what happens next is very interesting in that from about the middle part of the 18th century to the first half of the 19th century, there is a great deal of changing and exchanging diseases, mainly from Europe to the Americas, through the North Atlantic, that greatly affects North America and the Caribbean. So, for example, there's the influenza pandemics of the late 1700s. There were sporadic yellow fever epidemics. If you want to know why the capital is in Washington, D.C. and not Philadelphia, we need to include yellow fever in that. There was even yellow fever epidemics in Halifax, as north as there, and the Caribbean. Many of these are shared. Of course, there are also sporadic yellow fever epidemics in the Mediterranean ports. They'd be gone by the cooler months in winter. But then we also have to include cholera. The first pandemic, that didn't reach the Mediterranean coast. It didn't sweep through Europe. But the second cholera pandemic did, of course, and it also crossed the North Atlantic, Canada, and then downward through the North America. There was also influenza pandemic. Now, the Brazilians and foreign travelers and sailors were well aware of this. Right? I tell this to Brazilian historians, and they're sometimes surprised that really Brazil had a healthful reputation. I have a great deal of evidence that shows that Brazilian officials, sailors, foreign visitors were well aware that Brazil had been spared many of the same diseases that had crossed the North Atlantic. They didn't know how or why. There was some speculation, something about the equator and the sun kind of burning off the miasma. But they thought that they had, due to God's grace, and actually they would often say that in the reports, due to to providence, that they had been spared from these diseases. That began to change, though, and I think that Consul Turner's story and his death from yellow fever is the moment that changed, right? So I'm going to talk about really 4 diseases here: urban yellow fever, cholera, smallpox, and plague. These are the 4 diseases that I consider define the era of epidemics in Brazil in this period. I'm going to talk about each of them. I'm going to hold off for a minute to make it kind of more mysterious on why the 1849 things changed. But maybe you can come up with some guesses or think about it, and I'll come back to the causes of this. I'd like to just go over each of them, and then I'll end with some of the consequences for this research talk. All right. So let's start with urban yellow fever. So when when yellow fever arrived in late 1849, 1850, it took about a year for the imperial government to recognize it, to officially call it yellow fever, right? The first doctors to diagnose it as yellow fever were foreign doctors who had seen it elsewhere, right? And said, no, this is yellow fever, this is yellow fever. And but there was some equivocation on this, some doubts, but about a year in 1850, then the Brazilian government began to recognize it as it is. And they declared it as a new disease. This is a new disease that has arrived in Brazil, right? Now, there's debate about this because many Brazilian doctors looked at this disease and said, you know, I've seen symptoms like this. I've seen this same, we'd call it bilious fever, we'd call it, but this is not a new disease, right? So there was kind of debate about it, but the official position by 1851, 52 was that this was a new disease. Yet there was still information that suggested that there was some questions about this, right? And I believe, and this is kind of accepted by historians now, that yellow fever was imported. The virus of yellow fever was imported into Brazil. I don't think that is actually correct. And part of what I'm doing is to build a case that yellow fever wasn't a new disease, but something else was new, right? And this is a story that's going to be familiar to many of you. What was new was a new vector, right? Yellow fever is spread, as we know with Consul Turner, by the bite of mosquito. And it's really spread by particularly one is the culprit that you've been hearing about, the Aedes aegypti, because it's the same as the Zika and dengue, right? And what I think happened is that rather than this new virus, I think that there was a new mosquito, right? Because what we have here is we have majority of deaths by yellow fever were not among native-born Brazilians, but among foreigners, right? Why would that be the case if this was a new virus? It doesn't make any sense. And in fact, this table represents that foreigners, if they had been there longer, were largely spared, right? I mean, so the longer the residency, the better chances you had. There's also geographical arguments for for this being not a new disease but a new vector. When it first arrived, it didn't extend up above the aqueduct of Rio de Janeiro. So below in the lower city, near the harbor was really where the infection areas were. Above that, even foreigners were spared. So many foreigners, of course, moved up there. The problem is that by the late 1850s, and especially by the 1870s, this area had grown. So yellow fever had gone up the hills, right? By the 1890s, it had actually breached the very tall, enormous escarpment of Sao Paulo. If you take the trip down from Sao Paulo to Santos, it's a gigantic mountain. So what is that? Why did that happen? Well, the main reason is I think that this mosquito spread, and it took a greater foothold in the area, right? So I'll turn to this slide real quick to show that in the 20th century, scientists have found that the distribution of this mosquito to be highly variable. So I don't understand why we might think for the 20th century that the distribution of the Aedes aegypti would change so radically, but not in the 18th. So this is another piece of evidence that I think supports the introduction of the Aedes aegypti. So, but why is it? Okay, so a new mosquito came in. Why is it? Why would that cause death among some foreigners, but not the Brazilians? Well, I think the reason is that yellow fever has a sylvatic or jungle cycle, right? So it can pass between, in South America, the hemagogus, for example, and then bite primates, non-human primates, and then infect humans who are working near the forest or in the forest, right? The urban vector is very different. It's Aedes aegypti based, right? Aedes aegypti does not do well in the jungle. Other mosquitoes outcompete it. So what I think happened is that before 1849, most Brazilians, if they had lived there, had probably as children, had ventured into the forest areas and had become infected with yellow fever. When you're infected as a child, the symptoms are usually very minor. But then they had this natural lifelong immunity. Foreigners, though, came in before 49, were not infected or occasionally infected, and then they would be called bilious fever. But as this Aedes aegypti came in, there was this great reservoir of humans to infect, right? Yellow fever. right? There's other diseases here that changed as well. So in 1855, cholera made its first appearance in Brazil. And this was, it arrived in 1854, only 5 years after yellow fever arrived in Pará, the northern province. And a ship carrying immigrants. This is a big blow to the immigration program in Brazil. It spread rapidly through the populated coast. By the end of 55 and early 56, it had pretty much spread throughout all of the major cities in Brazil, except Sao Paulo. And as you might know, it's a bacteria, a Vibrio cholerae. It prefers warm or cool, stagnant water. You might remember the story of John Snow and the infamous Broad Street pump in London. It contaminates drinking water. It's very much a disease of the poor. It was the case then, as it is the case today, tragically, for example, in Haiti. So if you live near, if you use water which you also bathe in or clean your clothing in, you have a very good chance, if you're drinking that water and not boiling it, of getting a disease or other gastrointestinal diseases like cholera. So this was a disease of the poor in Brazil at this time. It disproportionately affected slaves, for example, and people of African heritage, so much so that there was often this confusion with the causal factor of race. You see this much more in the U.S., attributing it to race. In Brazil, less so, but there were some questions about, why is this only hitting people of color? Well, it's because society doesn't treat people of color very well, and they're usually very poor. So cholera was Brazil's really worst national epidemic. It killed between 200 and 250,000 people, even more than the flu epidemic of 1917, even in overall numbers, right? Other interesting thing about it is the Brazilian government didn't want, it wanted good news. It wanted good news. It wanted imports and exports. It wanted new immigrants, right? So by 55, the imperial government says, oh, wait a minute, no, this epidemic is done. It's over. It's run its course. But in fact, the sources show that it keeps going into the late 1850s. It sort of vanishes for 2 years, but I think it's lingering in kind of the backlands because it pops up in interior Pernambuco again in 1861, where then it strikes some of these provinces again and is carried in by recruits to Paraguay, because Brazil goes to war against Paraguay and the alliance of Argentina. And cholera might be, I was having a kind of debate with Thomas Wigan, who's the great historian of this war, about whether or not cholera was probably one of the top killers of that war. That with smallpox, I think, killed more than blade or bullets. So it was a terrible catastrophe, and from the front of this war, this tightly fought battle in the swamplands of the Paraguay River, it exploded outward, and cholera became epidemic in much of the interior South America. In Argentina, in fact, the first Argentine epidemics you see right around the war period. The great one in the late 1870s was a return. But you see it for the first time in Paraguay and Uruguay. So a real catastrophe, not only for Brazil, but also for South America. So it carries on really into the late 1860s. And so if you tally up all the deaths, you have an estimate, really this was the worst epidemic catastrophe to strike Brazil. Now, there was even, I'm just going to increase in the degrees of terror of these diseases, right? There was another disease, too, which killed more than cholera and yellow fever combined, but I can't say it's the worst epidemic episode, right? Because smallpox would come and go, right? Come and go. And this was a disease that was brought over by the first Europeans during the early colonial period, so probably spread from contact points in Peru across South America, affecting and killing Native Americans in what is now Brazil in the 1530s, 1540s. It caused a great deal of devastation. It's part of the reason why we have this Columbian exchange, or the germs part of Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? It was a major culprit for the decline of the indigenous population in the early colonial period. By the 17th century or so, 18th century especially, it continues to cause sporadic outbreak, but what I found is that these are mostly very localized outbreaks, right? So you have an outbreak in Maranhão in the north, or at Rio Grande do Sul in the south, but here and there, and usually about every decade or so, right? After 1850, however, this changes. And for the first time, I think it's in 1857, so 8 years after yellow fever became epidemic, cholera was continuing, it became a national epidemic, right? So this was a serious problem, and another demonstration that Brazil's epidemiological environment was changing. We see, for example, a rise in the number of epidemics and a slow decline, including after the famous vaccine revolt in 1904. The last one I'll just 30 seconds talk about was Bubonic Plague. Unlike the others, it did not become a severe epidemic, although it did become entrenched in the Northeast, and it was a problem. But it did spur on a kind of public health reforms that I think were instrumental for the end of the era of epidemics. Oh, I don't want to give it away. So, the causes, right? The causes. What changed? Anyone want to take a guess? 49? 49? This is Chargers territory, so... Yeah, there we go. I thought in the Bay Area, I would think, the 49ers fans. Gold rush. I think the gold rush is very important for this story. For the first time, we have hundreds of ships and thousands of people, mostly going from the Caribbean, where yellow fever was endemic, stopping in Rio de Janeiro, and then going rounding the coast up, as these advertisements show. And I believe that's what carried this vector into Brazil. Right, that's my hypothesis. The other thing is that there was the average numbers of days of travel between Rio and Liverpool and Lisbon, I've found, declined. Right, so these diseases like cholera, even influenza, might circulate on board, and probably did, but when it takes more than 50 days to almost 2 months to cross to these cities in Brazil, they burn out. Right, but by exactly the period that the era of epidemics, we have it down to 44, and it continues to decline in about 5 weeks to get across. So this allows ships to carry these across, right? So let me just go forward to, considering the time, let me go forward to a brief mention, I think, of this, because there's some real parallels. So I would argue that the era of epidemics ended in the late 1900s. So around 1909, 1910, this period is starting to change. It's mostly occurring in Brazil's wealthier cities. What we see is end of yellow fever, no cholera epidemics, and smallpox especially declines. Now, why is that? Well, in many ways, we have new information. For example, in 1904, it's confirmed in Brazil that it's a mosquito that causes yellow fever. So they have these mosquito brigades, just like they have today, that would go around and check flower pots and cisterns and all kinds of standing bodies of water that might harbor the Aedes aegypti, and they were successful in many ways. Again, these are the wealthier parts of Brazil. The poorer parts don't see these changes for decades later. So that's a very similar thing to what they're trying to do in Zika, and I think actually effectively. What else causes this era of epidemics to leave? Here we see, for example, the departure of Febre Amarela and the sort of the doctors following in this procession. Vaccination. There's finally good animal-based, bovine-based vaccination by the late 1890s. And then also I think one of the most important unsung heroes, not to make this a kind of positivist talk, I'll talk in a minute, but one of the unsung heroes is chlorine, right? Just a little drop of chemical in the water kills many of the causes of gastrointestinal infections, including cholera. And this occurred, again, not among the vast majority of poor Brazilians, but among those elite and even middle class, I would say. So that marks the end of the era of epidemics. And let me just talk briefly about some of the consequences. I'd be happy to go into some of these in more detail. List of these 6, right? I'm just going to focus on a few of them. I think I'll focus, for example, on end of slavery. For example, slavery ended by Emancipation Decree in 1888, but by then the population of slaves to the general population was quite small. I think it was about 10 to 15% in Brazil. Why was that? Well, the slave population didn't naturally regenerate, unlike in the United States. Slave trade ended in 1850, no more slave imports into Brazil, so the population had been declining. But what also aided the decline of the population. Tragically, I think it was these diseases, cholera especially. The impact of cholera on slaves was terrible. It killed, I'd say, about 80,000 slaves. It's an enormous number, not a number that the Brazilian government wanted to advertise. I've had to put it together through scattered records. But so the decline of the slave population, I think, has to be attributed in part to the era of epidemics. What else? European diaspora across the Atlantic. Now, if you look at the number of European ancestry, it's generally in these two poles, right? And that's generally been argued that it's a kind of climactic preference, right? So the Europeans were looking for climates and to do agriculture that wasn't too different than what they had in Europe. So the preference was either in the north or the far south, where they could be farmers or do something similar. But this doesn't explain why there's a great number of people of European descent in Cuba or in parts of Central America like Costa Rica or in parts of Brazil. And I would argue that, again, it's not the main causal factor, but we need to include this period of disease, because many of the thousands of Europeans crossing the Atlantic at this point occurred at the time that these diseases were breaking out, and they were well aware of them. In fact, some of the governments prohibited or warned against going to parts of Brazil. So I'm also finding that the era of epidemics could be a Latin American story, and so we might have a part of the reason why there's Europeans at the two poles of the Americas, in part because of the shifting epidemiological environment that occurred in the 19th century. Now, I'm not saying it's the top cause. I'm just suggesting it's a cause, right? Finally, I'll do two more quick. Regional inequality. If you see by population, if you take population as an indicator of wealth, it's problematic, but we could say this, just there's other indicators as well. We'll see that the Northeast had a larger population compared to the Southeast, right? But by 1872. But if you look by the mid-20th century, that's flipped, and the Southeast is much larger. And as we know now, Sao Paulo is much wealthier than the Northeast. So diseases like cholera and smallpox hit the Northeast much harder. So for example, 12 slaves for every one slave that died in Sao Paulo, 12 died in the Northeast. So the loss of life, the loss of wealth was not distributed evenly. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up with the consequences with this demographic, with some demographics. We see real population growth, almost exponential in the United States, occurring after 1850. This is the same time that some of the same diseases that were affecting the United States, yellow fever, cholera, smallpox, began to lessen in their intensity and virulence after 1850. The opposite was the case for Brazil. These diseases instead increased in their virulence and frequency. So I think that dampened the population growth of Brazil. Again, also many immigrants aren't choosing to go to Brazil. But by the end of the era of epidemics, we see this explosion, right? As there's better water supplies, as there's vaccine, as there's just new conditions for growth of the population and immigration. Okay, so again, I don't want to make this a kind of positivist, triumphant science prevailed and now we live in a better world. I think in some ways we do. I wouldn't want to be living in the 1850s, 1860s at this time. It would have been very, very risky. But I also want to emphasize that the idea of this war against germs and that science will prevail is a kind of outdated notion. In fact, in just the last Sunday review of the New York Times, there's yet another article about the immune system and the microbiome, right? I think that we're coming into a period in which we need to recognize, and I'm not clearly, many others do this already, that humanity and microbes live in a kind of changing and dynamic relationship, right? We can't have a war on germs because we survive because of germs, right? We are healthy, we continue to live, and we may be happy because of the microbes that are within us, right? So if we start to see this as a kind of changing and dynamic relationship, that's, I think, gets us a little bit better, a much better model in understanding historical change. It's not a historical change to this ultimate utopia, but one in which we're going to continue to see this relationship change, as we are seeing with Zika-related microcephaly, which again is a very similar story to yellow fever with this spread of this new mosquito, which isn't often talked about. Aedes aegypti has taken on much more ground. That's why there's more dengue also in Brazil, but also then the importation of this new virus that is also spread through the same avenues.